Tonight, you are about to step into one of the strangest and most forgotten chapters in American history. Because long before the White House stood in flames, long before British soldiers marched through the streets of Washington, thousands of Americans had already abandoned the United States, not because they hated freedom, not because they were defeated, but because they believed the American Revolution itself had gone terribly wrong. And so while a new republic celebrated its independence in 1776, entire families quietly packed their belongings, boarded crowded ships, and disappeared into the cold forests of British Canada. There, they started over. They built farms. They founded towns. They raised children who no longer called themselves Americans. And then, less than 40 years later, something extraordinary happened. The United States invaded Canada. Many Americans expected an easy victory. Some politicians even believed Canadians would welcome them with open arms. Instead, they met fierce resistance. The descendants of those forgotten refugees stood beside British soldiers, local militias, and indigenous allies to defend the land they had come to call home. The war spread across rivers, forests, and the Great Lakes. Cities burned, armies marched, and in the summer of 1814, the conflict reached an unthinkable climax. British troops entered Washington, and for the first and only time in American history, the White House burned. How did a revolution that promised liberty lead to Americans becoming refugees? Why did the United States try to conquer Canada? And how did a war that began on the northern frontier end with flames rising over the nation's capital? Tonight, as you settle in and allow the noise of the modern world to fade away, you will travel back to a time when neighbors became enemies, loyalties, divided families, and the future of North America hung in the balance. This is the forgotten story of 1776 to 1814. A story of exile, of war, and of two nations discovering who they would become. Before we uncover this forgotten chapter of history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more calming historical journeys. And while you're settling in, leave a comment sharing your location and local time. It's always wonderful to see where in the world we're traveling together tonight. Now dim the lights and join me as we travel back to a world where neighbors became enemies, loyalties divided families, and the future of two nations had yet to be written. Now we begin in the year 1776. Section 1. Tonight you find yourself in the summer of 1776. The air feels warm and heavy, carrying the scent of horse sweat, fresh hay and wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. Somewhere nearby, church bells ring with unusual excitement. Men gather in taverns. Women exchange whispers beside market stalls. Children chase one another through dusty streets, unaware that history has chosen their generation for extraordinary times. For some people, this summer feels like a celebration. For others, it feels like the beginning of something frightening. And that, perhaps, is the first surprise, waiting quietly inside tonight's story. Because when most people remember the American Revolution, they imagine an entire nation standing together against Britain. Reality, as usual, prefers something much messier. You live in a world where loyalty means different things to different people. Some neighbors speak passionately about liberty and independence. Their voices rise with excitement over mugs of ale and steaming bowls of stew. They speak of rights representation and freedom from distant rulers. Others remain uncertain, and some remain fiercely loyal to King George III. Strange, isn't it? Modern memory often paints the revolution as a simple struggle between heroes and villains. But ordinary life rarely works that way. Most people are not interested in becoming legends. Most people simply want enough food for winter-healthy children, and perhaps fewer taxes than last year. Not exactly dramatic ambitions. As evening approaches, candles flicker softly behind small windows. The smell of roasted pork mixes with fresh bread cooling on wooden tables. Dogs bark somewhere beyond the fences. Crickets begin their nightly songs. Life still feels ordinary. Yet conversations have changed. You notice it dabas everywhere. At church gatherings, inside blacksmith shops, beside wells and market squares. People speak more quietly now. They glance over their shoulders. Certain names are no longer mentioned so openly. Political arguments have a habit of ruining supper. And occasionally, entire families. Historians still debate precisely how many colonists actively supported independence. Some estimates suggest around 40%. Others propose slightly different numbers. But most scholars agree on one thing. America was divided. Deeply divided. Many people supported rebellion. Many remained neutral. And a considerable number remained loyal to Britain. These loyalists came from every corner of colonial society. Some were wealthy merchants. Others owned modest farms. Some had fought alongside British soldiers during earlier conflicts. Many simply believed stability mattered more than revolution. Perhaps they feared chaos. Perhaps they distrusted sudden change. Or perhaps they simply preferred the familiar world they had always known. After all, the British Empire had protected these colonies for generations. British ships carried goods across oceans. British laws governed daily life. British coins passed through every market and pocket. And King George III, despite what later generations might imagine, was not viewed as a monster by everyone. Far from it. For many families, loyalty to the crown felt natural, normal even. Human beings, you discover, become attached to familiar things, especially uncertain humans. During these years, newspapers spread rumors almost as quickly as facts. Fresh sheets of ink carried reports from Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Some stories inspired hope. Others spread fear. People argued over tea. People argued over taxes. People argued over Parliament. And occasionally, they argued over absolutely everything. Human nature has always been wonderfully consistent. By candlelight, fathers debated sons. Brothers disagreed with brothers. Ministers delivered sermons that left congregations uneasy. Neighbors who had shared harvest celebrations for years suddenly found themselves standing on opposite sides of history. It happened slowly, then all at once. Some loyalists kept their opinions private. Others spoke openly. Neither choice guaranteed safety. As tensions increased, accusations became common. Businesses suffered. Friendships faded. Angry crowds occasionally gathered. A few unfortunate souls found themselves covered in tar and feathers, a punishment designed more for humiliation than mercy. Not exactly the sort of neighborhood dispute anyone enjoys. Meanwhile, the war itself crept closer. Soldiers marched. Supplies disappeared. Prices climbed. Letters stopped arriving. And uncertainty settled over everyday life like a cold morning fog. Many ordinary people cared little for grand political theories. They cared about surviving. They cared about keeping their farms. They cared about keeping families together. And sometimes those goals proved impossible. Imagine sitting beside a small fire after sunset. The room smells faintly of beeswax candles and drying herbs hanging from ceiling beams. Rain taps softly against wooden shutters. Your wife mends clothing by dim light. One son speaks excitedly about independence. Another remains loyal to the king. And you perhaps wonder whether any of this madness will simply pass. It won't, Because revolutions rarely ask politely for your opinion. Eventually, they demand your answer. And answers come with consequences. Some families adapt, others break apart. One curious detail, often overlooked by history, is that thousands of enslaved people also faced impossible choices. The British promised freedom to many who escaped rebel owners, creating another layer of complexity historians continue discussing today. Nothing about this conflict is simple, and perhaps simplicity was never possible. Outside summer nights remain beautiful. Fireflies drift above fields. Owls call from distant trees. The smell of pine and damp earth fills the darkness. Nature, it seems, remains wonderfully indifferent to human politics. Yet beneath that peaceful sky, something irreversible has already begun. A new nation is struggling to be born. But not everyone wishes to welcome it. And in the years ahead, thousands of ordinary men, women, and children will make a heartbreaking decision. Rather than remain inside the new United States, they will leave. Not for a season, not for adventure, but forever. Tonight, however, that future still lies hidden beyond the horizon. For now, you sit quietly beneath the stars of 1776, and without realizing it, you are living through the beginning of one of the greatest migrations in North American history. Section 2. Morning arrives quietly. A thin mist hangs above the fields, and dew clings to tall grass beneath your boots. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a rooster announces the new day with far more confidence than accuracy. The smell of damp earth rises with the first warmth of sunlight. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, and for a few peaceful moments, life almost feels normal again. Almost, because beneath these familiar sounds and smells, something has changed. The revolution is no longer just an argument carried by newspapers and tavern conversations. It has become personal, and that changes everything. You discover that loyalty, much like religion or family traditions, is rarely simple. People choose sides for reasons that are sometimes noble, sometimes practical, and occasionally rather confusing. One neighbor joins the Patriots because he dreams of liberty. Another because he dislikes taxes. Another because his friends have already joined. And another simply because he does not trust politicians 3,000 miles away. Human beings, after all, rarely fit neatly into categories. Across the colonies, men and women wrestle with impossible questions. What do you owe your king? What do you owe your neighbors? What do you owe your family? And perhaps most difficult of all, what do you owe yourself? Historians still disagree about the exact number of loyalists living in the colonies. Some scholars suggest 500,000. Others argue for smaller figures. Records from the period remain incomplete, and many people carefully hid their opinions, which, considering the circumstances, seems entirely understandable. After all, expressing the wrong opinion could cost you far more than a friendship. It might cost your livelihood, or your safety, or your home. Inside churches, prayers themselves become political. Some ministers pray for King George III. Others avoid mentioning him altogether. Congregations sit stiffly on wooden benches, wondering who among them supports which side. Not exactly relaxing Sunday mornings. Even weddings become awkward. Imagine attending a family gathering. The smell of roast chicken fills the room. Candles flicker softly against whitewashed walls. Someone pours cider into heavy mugs. Children laugh near the fireplace. And then one uncle mentions independence. Silence follows. Everyone suddenly finds their potatoes fascinating. Conversations shift toward weather, or livestock, or anything else, because nobody wishes to ruin dessert. But tensions continue growing. By 1776, neutrality itself becomes dangerous. Patriot committees form across towns and villages. They monitor loyalties. They investigate rumors. They publish names. Sometimes they enforce boycotts. Sometimes they demand public declarations. And occasionally, they rely on intimidation. Most revolutionaries believe they are protecting liberty. Most loyalists believe they are defending order. Neither side imagines itself as the villain. And perhaps that is another uncomfortable truth hidden within history. People rarely wake up believing they are the bad guys. One unusual story from the period tells of neighbors secretly leaving food for one another, despite standing on opposite political sides. Historians cannot always verify such accounts, but stories like these survived through family traditions long after the war ended. Because even in divided times, kindness has a stubborn habit of surviving. Still, fear spreads. Merchants lose customers. Teachers lose positions. Ministers lose congregations. Families lose trust. And slowly suspicion creeps into everyday life. At night, candles burn later than usual. Voices stay low. Letters are hidden. Visitors are greeted cautiously. Even children begin noticing the tension. Children always notice, though adults often pretend otherwise. One son may dream of fighting for General Washington. Another dreams of wearing the king's uniform. Their mother prays they both stay alive. Poor woman. History seldom asks permission before creating headaches. Meanwhile, violence becomes increasingly common. Mobs gather. Homes are searched. Property is confiscated. Some loyalists are arrested. Others flee before trouble reaches their door. Many hope the unrest will soon disappear. Surely things cannot become worse. Human beings have repeated that sentence throughout history with remarkable consistency. And history usually answers with unpleasant surprises. British victories bring hope to loyalists. American victories bring hope to patriots. Ordinary families simply hope for peace. Yet peace seems increasingly distant. Outside autumn slowly approaches. The scent of harvested corn fills the air. Leaves begin changing colors along the roads. Geese travel south beneath pale skies. Farmers work from sunrise until dusk, storing food for winter. Nature continues its endless routines. Human politics feel much smaller beside such rhythms. But even nature cannot shield people forever. News arrives from distant battles. New rumors follow. New fears emerge. And then another troubling reality becomes impossible to ignore. If the Patriots succeed, what future awaits those who remained loyal to Britain? Some believe reconciliation will come. Others are less optimistic. Many loyalists quietly begin preparing for possibilities they hardly dare mention aloud. A few hide valuables beneath floorboards. Some sell livestock. Others save money in secret. And some begin studying maps. Maps leading north, to Nova Scotia, to Quebec, to unknown lands still governed by the British Crown. Most have never seen those places. Many know almost nothing about them. The winters are said to be harsher, the forests endless, the distances unimaginable. Still, uncertainty sometimes makes strangers of familiar places, and familiar places no longer feel safe. Historians continue debating whether many loyalists plan to leave early, or whether circumstances forced their decisions later. Evidence suggests both explanations contain some truth. Human beings often hope things will improve, until they don't. And as another year draws closer to its end, thousands of families find themselves asking a question they never imagined facing. If this new United States truly becomes independent, will there still be a place for people like us? For now, no answer arrives. Only long evenings, cold winds, and quiet conversations around flickering candlelight. Yet beyond the northern forests, beyond rivers and mountains, few have ever crossed. Another future waits patiently, a difficult future, an uncertain future, but perhaps a future nonetheless, and soon many will choose it, even though doing so means leaving everything behind. Section 3. By the spring of 1783, you begin to understand that some journeys are not chosen with excitement. They are chosen with sadness. The war that had divided neighbors and families for nearly 8 years is finally drawing to an end. News travels slowly, carried by riders' ships, and rumors that arrive weeks ahead of certainty. Somewhere far away, diplomats have signed agreements. Armies are preparing to stand down, and a new nation has survived. For patriots, the news brings relief. For loyalists, it brings questions. Very uncomfortable questions. The smell of wet soil rises from the fields as spring returns. Robins hop through orchards. Streams swell with melted snow. Nature, rather unfairly perhaps, appears entirely unconcerned with politics. Yet inside homes throughout New York, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and the Carolinas, countless families sit beside evening fires and speak quietly. Because now comes the difficult part. What happens next? Some hope forgiveness will follow. Some expect old friendships to heal. Others are less certain. After years of violence, suspicion, and bitterness, trust has become a fragile thing. Property belonging to loyalists has been seized in many areas. Businesses have collapsed. Names have appeared on lists. In some towns, returning to ordinary life feels impossible. Not everyone faces danger, but enough do. Enough to make people wonder. Enough to make people leave. Historians estimate that roughly 60,000 loyalists eventually departed the United States after the Revolution. Scholars continue debating the exact figures, but few disagree about the scale. It becomes one of the largest migrations in North American history. And unlike adventurous settlers heading westward, these people leave with heavy hearts. Because exile, even voluntary exile, hurts. Imagine standing inside your farmhouse one final evening. The smell of bread baking lingers in the air. Candles flicker softly against familiar walls. The wooden table where generations gathered remains exactly where it always stood. Outside, frogs sing beside the creek. Everything feels normal, except nothing is. Tomorrow, you leave. Perhaps forever. The thought settles heavily upon your chest. Some families bury valuables they cannot carry. Others sell possessions for whatever price buyers offer. Many pack only essentials: clothing, tools, family Bibles. Photographs do not yet exist, so memories must travel inside human hearts. And memories weigh surprisingly little, yet they feel impossibly heavy. One curious story tells of families carrying door keys with them to Canada, believing they might someday return home. Historians still debate how common this practice truly was, but similar stories survived through generations. Human beings are wonderfully optimistic creatures, even when saying goodbye. In New York City, thousands gather near crowded docks. Ships creak against wooden piers. Sailors shout commands. Horses stamp impatiently. The smell of salt water mixes with fish sweat and tar. Children cling to mothers. Mothers wipe away tears. Fathers try very hard to appear brave. Poor fellows. They discover bravery and sadness often arrive together. British troops prepare to evacuate as well. Loyalist refugees crowd onto vessels, bound for Nova Scotia, Quebec, and other distant colonies. cabins overflow. Supplies run short. Privacy becomes a forgotten luxury. The Atlantic winds care little for comfort. Seasickness becomes an unwelcome companion. Not exactly the grand adventure promised in storybooks. And yet hope survives, because hope always seems to travel with human beings, even frightened ones. The journey itself proves difficult. Some ships encounter storms, others suffer shortages. Disease spreads among passengers packed tightly together. Babies cry through long nights. Elderly travelers endure constant discomfort. Still, they continue northward, toward lands many have never seen, toward forests and rivers described by maps more hopeful than accurate, toward uncertainty. The largest destination becomes Nova Scotia. Ironically, the name means New Scotland, though many arriving there have never seen Scotland either. The first sight of land often brings relief. Pine forests stretch toward gray skies. Cold winds sweep across rocky shores. Gulls cry overhead. The smell of salt and evergreen fills the air. Beautiful and intimidating. Some settlers arrive expecting established towns. Instead, they find wilderness, trees, mud, more trees, and occasionally even more mud. Human optimism encounters geography. Geography usually wins. Shelters must be built quickly. Supplies remain limited. Roads barely exist. Winters approach faster than expected. Families accustomed to farms and villages suddenly face unfamiliar landscapes. Many struggle. Some regret leaving. Others stubbornly refuse to regret anything, which admittedly sounds exactly like human nature. Meanwhile, another destination awaits farther inland: Quebec, the vast northern territory that would eventually produce Upper Canada, the future Ontario. At the time, however, it remains largely wilderness crossed by rivers and forests, not exactly ideal conditions for homesick refugees. Yet that is where many journeys lead. Scholars continue debating whether British authorities adequately prepared for the flood of newcomers. Records reveal confusion shortages and plenty of administrative headaches. Governments, it seems, have always possessed remarkable talents for paperwork and chaos. Still, communities begin forming. Churches appear. Schools follow. Fields are cleared. Families adapt. And slowly something unexpected begins happening. The refugees who left America do not merely survive. They begin creating new homes, new traditions, new identities. Yet in quiet moments, memories remain. The smell of orchards in New York, warm evenings in Pennsylvania, friends left behind, brothers never seen again. For many, America remains a wound that never fully heals. And perhaps that is the strange burden carried by exiles everywhere. You leave one world behind, but a part of your heart stays there, forever. Still beneath the towering pines and endless northern skies, children laugh again. Axes strike trees. Smoke rises from chimneys. And what began as a painful departure slowly transforms into something unexpected. A beginning. Section 4. You awaken before sunrise to the sound of wind moving through tall pines. The air feels colder than anything you remember from Virginia or New York. A faint mist hangs above the river, and somewhere beyond the trees, loons call across still water with their strange, lonely voices. The smell of damp earth mixes with fresh cut timber and smoke drifting from dying embers. It is beautiful and completely unfamiliar. The land that British officials promised on maps often looks rather different in person. Maps, after all, have a remarkable talent for leaving out uncomfortable details, such as endless forests, or mosquitoes, or winters capable of testing the patience of saints. Yet here you are, And here, thousands of other Loyalist families now find themselves. By the mid-1780s, settlements are beginning to appear across Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and along the St. Lawrence River. Historians generally agree that these refugees transformed British North America in ways few people could have predicted. They bring skills, they bring traditions, they bring hopes, and perhaps most importantly, they bring experience. Many already know how to clear land, build homes, and survive difficult conditions, which proves fortunate because difficult conditions arrive with great enthusiasm. The forests seem endless. Towering pines and maples stretch in every direction. Rivers cut through the wilderness like silver ribbons. In summer, wildflowers fill open meadows. In autumn, brilliant colors spread across hillsides. And then winter arrives. Winter always has a flair for dramatic entrances. The first snowfall surprises newcomers. Then another follows. Soon the rivers freeze, and the world becomes silent beneath deep blankets of snow. The air bites exposed skin. Wood becomes more valuable than money. Candles burn longer. Everything slows. You quickly learn that surviving a Canadian winter requires planning patience and a healthy respect for nature. Fortunately, many Indigenous communities possess generations of knowledge about these lands. Through trade and cooperation, newcomers learn valuable lessons about hunting snowshoes and surviving northern climates. Historians continue discussing the complexity of these relationships. Some were peaceful, some involved misunderstandings. Others changed dramatically over time. Human relationships rarely remain simple. Still, knowledge passes between cultures. And sometimes, survival itself becomes the teacher. One curious tradition described by early settlers involved placing heated stones beneath blankets before bedtime. Historians are uncertain how widespread the practice was, but enough accounts survive to suggest that creative solutions flourished during harsh winters. Desperation often inspires innovation. As settlements expand, communities slowly emerge. Small churches rise beside muddy roads. Blacksmith shops begin operating. Mills appear along rivers. Schools open inside rough wooden buildings. Life feels difficult, but life continues. The smell of fresh bread drifts through cabins. Children laugh while chasing chickens. Dogs bark at absolutely nothing, as dogs have done throughout history with impressive consistency. And gradually, friendships form. Neighbors help raise barns. Families gather for harvest celebrations. Stories are exchanged around fireplaces. Music returns. Human beings, you discover, possess extraordinary talents for creating homes, even after losing one. Among these refugees are people from every walk of life. Former merchants now cut timber. Lawyers become farmers. Soldiers become fishermen. And everyone complains about weather, which somehow makes communities feel normal again. British authorities attempt to organize land grants for the newcomers, though efficiency proves somewhat elusive. Delays frustrate settlers. Paperwork disappears. Boundaries remain unclear. Government officials, it seems, were perfectly capable of creating headaches long before modern bureaucracy arrived. Nevertheless, farms spread, villages grow, and one particularly remarkable development occurs in 1784. New Brunswick becomes a separate colony. Historians generally agree that Loyalist migration played a major role in its creation. A population large enough to demand its own administration has appeared almost overnight. Not bad for people arriving with little more than hope and determination. Still, not everyone thrives. Some settlements struggle terribly. Crops fail. Supplies run short. Disease appears. Harsh winters claim lives. Families move elsewhere, searching for better opportunities. The northern frontier remains unforgiving. Nature does not reward optimism alone. It demands hard work and patience. Lots of patience. Yet as years pass, children born in these communities begin growing up beneath different skies. They hear stories about New York and Boston from parents who speak with distant memories in their eyes. They listen to tales of lost homes and old neighbors. To them, these places sound almost mythical. Interesting stories, but not home. Home is here. Home is the frozen river. Home is the pine forest. Home is the sound of the pine forest. Home is the sound of sleigh bells across winter snow. And perhaps that marks the beginning of something unexpected. Something few refugees could have imagined. Because while mothers and fathers remember America, their children remember Canada. The old country becomes a memory. The new land becomes reality. Historians still debate exactly when a separate Canadian identity truly began forming. Some point to later decades. Others see its roots here among the Loyalist settlements of the 1780s. Perhaps both views contain truth. Identity grows slowly, like forests, or families, or traditions passed quietly from one generation to the next. And beneath these vast northern skies, a new generation is already arriving. Children who have never seen the United States. Children who know only this land. Children who will one day face an unexpected challenge. Because far to the south, another young nation is growing. Growing stronger. Growing larger. And one day, that nation will look north. Section 5. Years pass so quietly that you hardly notice them. One winter melts into spring. One harvest follows another. Children grow taller. Gray hairs begin appearing where none existed before. And somewhere between chopping wood, repairing fences, and complaining about mosquitoes, life slowly settles into something that feels wonderfully ordinary. Which, if you think about it, is all most people ever wanted. Not glory, not fame, just ordinary. By the 1790s, the panic and uncertainty that once haunted the Loyalist refugees have begun to fade. The smell of fresh-cut hay fills summer afternoons. Horses pull wagons along rough roads. Church bells ring across villages built by hands that once trembled with uncertainty. And now something unexpected is happening. The children are changing. Not physically, of course. Children insist on doing that, no matter what century they inhabit. No, something deeper is changing. The sons and daughters born in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Upper Canada listen politely when their parents speak about New York or Philadelphia. They hear stories about old farms and familiar rivers. They nod respectfully. But to them, those places belong to another world, almost another lifetime. Their memories belong here, to frozen lakes, to maple forests, to long winters and muddy springs, to this northern land. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing, America becomes a memory. Home becomes Canada. Historians continue debating exactly when a distinct Canadian identity first emerged. Some argue that people still considered themselves British subjects above all else. Others believe the Loyalist experience created something unique long before the word Canadian carried modern meaning. Perhaps identities are like trees. They grow quietly, and only later do people notice how tall they have become. Life in these settlements remains difficult. Winter never loses its enthusiasm. The smell of burning pine fills cabins during long evenings. Snow piles against doors. Wolves howl somewhere beyond the tree line. Candles flicker softly, while families gather beside fireplaces. Stories become entertainment. Books remain precious. Music becomes a comfort. And gossip naturally survives every age. Human beings are wonderfully dependable in that regard. Meanwhile, roads improve. Trade expands. More settlers arrive. Small villages become towns. Ferries connect communities. Ships carry goods between Halifax, Quebec, Montreal, and the growing settlements farther west. Life remains hard, but it no longer feels temporary. And that changes everything. One curious tradition recorded by travelers described settlers gathering for communal maple sugar harvests every spring. Historians debate how widespread these celebrations truly were, but accounts suggest they brought together entire communities after long winters. After months of snow, people welcomed almost any excuse to celebrate. And honestly, who could blame them? Meanwhile, another force continues shaping these northern lands. The British Empire. Though separated by thousands of miles, Britain remains present everywhere. Portraits of King George III hang inside public buildings. British soldiers patrol forts. British laws govern daily life. British merchants dominate trade. To many former loyalists, this connection provides comfort. The empire they once defended still exists, and they remain part of it. Yet life continues changing. Because children possess annoying habits, they grow up and ask questions. Young men born in Upper Canada wonder why their parents speak so bitterly about places they have never seen. Young women raised along the St. Lawrence hear stories about cousins in New York and wonder why families remain divided. Time softens old wounds, though never completely. Some refugees still carry keys to homes they abandoned decades earlier. Others preserve family Bibles, letters, and memories from lives left behind. Historians still argue whether many loyalists secretly hoped to return south one day. Evidence suggests that some never abandoned that dream. But dreams fade. Reality remains. And reality smells like pine forests and wood smoke. Reality sounds like sleigh runners scraping across snow. Reality feels like frozen mornings and warm kitchens. Reality is here. By the turn of the 19th century, something remarkable has happened. A generation has come of age without memories of the revolution. Children born after the war now become adults. To them, stories of exile sound almost unbelievable. Imagine hearing your mother describe boarding crowded ships in New York while enemy armies marched nearby. Imagine listening to your grandfather speak of neighbors becoming enemies. It would sound like ancient history. And perhaps that is how peace begins. Not with treaties, but with generations. Yet peace itself proves fragile. Because far across the Atlantic Ocean, Europe is changing. A man named Napoleon Bonaparte rises to power in France. Kingdoms tremble. Armies march. Nations fall. Britain finds itself locked in another struggle, one far larger than the American Revolution. And those distant wars affect even these quiet northern communities. Prices rise. Trade changes. Ships disappear. Rumors spread. The empire once again demands attention. Still, life continues. Children chase dogs across fields. Fishermen repair nets. Farmers pray for rain. And most people assume the horrors of war belong safely in the past. After all, who would be foolish enough to start another conflict, especially between Britain and the young United States? Surely neighbors who share languages, customs, and histories have learned something from the previous disaster. Surely old wounds have healed. Surely everyone prefers peace. Poor humans. We are endlessly optimistic creatures. Because while families build farms and celebrate weddings beneath peaceful skies, something else is quietly growing to the south. Confidence, ambition, and a belief shared by many Americans that the northern colonies might someday become part of the United States. Not through hatred, not through conquest, or so they imagine. Perhaps simply through destiny. And destiny, unfortunately, has a way of causing trouble. Section 6. As the new century begins, you notice that the world feels larger than it once did. Not because the forests have changed, not because the rivers have grown wider, but because news now arrives carrying whispers from distant continents, strange names and conflicts unfolding thousands of miles away. And somehow, those distant troubles have a habit of appearing on your doorstep, even when uninvited. The year is now somewhere in the early 1800s. Morning mist rises above the St. Lawrence River. Canoes glide silently through calm waters. Horses pull wagons along muddy roads still scarred by spring rains. The smell of wet pine and wood smoke fills the air as villages awaken beneath pale sunlight. Life feels peaceful, almost peaceful. But beyond the Atlantic Ocean, Europe is in turmoil. Napoleon Bonaparte has transformed France into a military power, unlike anything seen in generations. Kingdom after kingdom bends beneath his armies. British ships patrol the seas. Trade routes shift. Prices rise and fall unpredictably. And somehow everyone seems angry with everyone else. Human beings truly possess remarkable talents for that. Britain and France are locked in a struggle that stretches across continents. Their conflict affects merchant sailors and governments far beyond Europe. Even farmers in Upper Canada begin hearing strange names spoken around tavern tables. Austerlitz, Trafalgar, Spain, Russia, places few settlers will ever see. Yet these distant events slowly begin affecting daily life. The smell of imported tea becomes rarer. Certain goods cost more. Merchants complain loudly, which historians would probably agree has always been one of humanity's oldest traditions. Meanwhile, to the south, the United States continues growing. The young republic survives. It prospers. And perhaps most surprising of all, it gains confidence. A great deal of confidence. New towns appear. Population increases rapidly. Roads stretch westward. And Americans begin imagining futures that seem limitless. Some politicians speak openly about expansion. Others dream quietly. Many believe the United States represents something unique in human history. And perhaps they are not entirely wrong. But confidence occasionally produces assumptions, and assumptions can become dangerous. One curious rumor circulating among American politicians suggested that British Canada remained weak and vulnerable. Some even imagined that its inhabitants secretly wished to join the United States. Historians continue debating how widespread such beliefs truly were. But surviving letters and speeches suggest that many Americans expected Canadians to welcome them enthusiastically. This assumption would eventually age rather poorly, though nobody knows that yet. For now, the border remains peaceful. Families trade across rivers. Merchants exchange goods. Travelers move between settlements. Many people have relatives living on both sides. After all, history had divided governments, not bloodlines. Imagine sitting beside a fire one autumn evening. The smell of roasting venison fills the room. Rain taps softly against shutters. Children doze beneath wool blankets while grandparents speak of old days in New York. Outside wind rustles maple leaves. Inside life feels wonderfully ordinary. War seems distant, almost forgotten. Yet young men growing up in Upper Canada know little about exile. They know only this land, its forests, its rivers, its bitter winters. And increasingly, they see themselves not as refugees, but as defenders of home. That subtle change matters, more than anyone realizes. Historians still debate exactly when Loyalist descendants began developing identities separate from both Americans and British-born settlers. But evidence suggests that by the early 19th century, many already viewed Upper Canada as something worth protecting. Not because it was perfect, because nowhere is, but because it belonged to them, and belonging changes people. One interesting observation recorded by travelers noted that settlers in Upper Canada often mixed American customs with British traditions. They celebrated familiar holidays, used familiar farming methods, and sometimes spoke with accents inherited from places they had never seen. Human cultures are wonderfully stubborn. They carry memories for generations. Yet memories slowly fade. Children become adults. Adults become grandparents. And stories become history. Meanwhile, tensions between Britain and the United States continue growing. American sailors complain about British interference at sea. British commanders worry about Napoleon. Newspapers print angry articles. Politicians exchange accusations. Everyone insists they desire peace, which usually means peace has become nervous. The issue of impressment especially angers Americans. British ships stop vessels and seize sailors suspected of being British subjects. The practice outrages the young republic. Many Americans view it as an insult. Others see it as an attack upon national honor. And honor, as history repeatedly demonstrates, has persuaded countless nations to do remarkably expensive things. Still, ordinary people continue planting crops. Fishermen continue mending nets. Children continue chasing chickens with unnecessary enthusiasm. Life goes on, because most people never expect history to knock directly upon their door, not twice, certainly not after everything already endured. And yet beneath peaceful evenings and quiet harvests, something invisible continues growing. Pride, ambition, misunderstanding, and assumptions, especially assumptions. Far to the south, some American politicians have begun speaking about Canada in curious ways. Not as another country, not even as a true enemy, but almost as unfinished business. And somewhere inside those conversations lies an idea that will soon plunge North America into war once again. A war many people believe will last only weeks. A war some expect Canadians to welcome. A war that will surprise nearly everyone. Section 7. By the year 1812, you have grown accustomed to peace. Not perfect peace, of course. Perfect peace exists mostly in poetry and political speeches. Real life feels much quieter. The smell of fresh bread still drifts from kitchens before sunrise. Farmers walk into fields covered with morning dew. Merchants open their shops. Children chase geese with far more enthusiasm than wisdom. And after nearly 30 years without another revolution, many people assume the old troubles belong safely to history. History, unfortunately, dislikes retirement. Across the United States, conversations are changing. Newspapers grow louder. Politicians grow bolder. And young congressmen, later called the war hawks, speak passionately about national honor, British interference, and the future of North America. Some demand action. Others demand patience. And almost nobody agrees about anything, which in fairness sounds very familiar. American anger toward Britain has several causes. British warships continue impressing sailors from American vessels. Trade restrictions damage commerce. Frontier conflicts involving indigenous nations create further tensions. And then there is Canada. Quiet, cold, and apparently, according to some politicians, ready to join the United States at any moment. Historians continue debating how seriously Americans believed this. Some scholars argue the desire to conquer Canada played only a secondary role. Others point to speeches suggesting that expansion remained an important goal. Perhaps both are right. Human motives rarely fit inside neat little boxes. Still, one statement becomes famous. Thomas Jefferson, now retired from the presidency, confidently predicts that taking Canada would be a mere matter of marching. Simple enough, at least on paper. Paper, however, rarely complains about weather, or forests, or determined people, or supply lines stretching hundreds of miles. Maps have a talent for making difficult things appear wonderfully easy. Inside taverns across the United States, confidence runs high. Men discuss quick victories over mugs of cider. Newspapers predict success. Some imagine Canadians throwing open their doors to American troops. After all, many settlers originally came from the United States. Surely they would welcome reunion. Surely. That word causes trouble throughout history. Meanwhile, life continues quietly in Upper Canada. Summer arrives with warm days and cool evenings. The smell of pine needles mixes with wildflowers growing beside rivers. Canoes move across calm waters. Horses graze peacefully. Church bells ring every Sunday. War feels distant, until it doesn't. Many Loyalist families still remember the Revolution. They remember leaving homes. They remember crowded ships. They remember beginning again. Their children know those stories by heart, and those children are now adults. Adults who have never lived in America. Adults who think of these forests and rivers as home. One curious observation recorded by travelers described how settlers often referred to themselves simply as the people here, rather than Canadians. Historians still discuss how identities were evolving during these years. Names matter less than loyalties, and loyalties, as always, remain amply personal. British regulars stationed in Canada number surprisingly few. The entire colony relies heavily upon local militias and alliances with indigenous nations. Resources remain limited. Roads are poor. Supplies travel slowly. On paper, the United States appears overwhelmingly stronger. Larger population, more resources, more confidence. Definitely more confidence. General William Hull, one of the American commanders, reportedly carries printed proclamations promising liberation to Canadians. They are written with optimism and perhaps a touch of overconfidence. He expects grateful crowds. Instead, he discovers uncertainty. Many settlers feel no desire to exchange one government for another. Some remain loyal to Britain. Others simply wish to avoid another war. Most people, regardless of century, prefer peaceful harvests to political theories. Strange creatures, humans. As tensions rise, rumors spread through villages. Whispers travel faster than wagons. British officers inspect defenses. Militia units gather for training. Farmers continue harvesting crops, while quietly wondering whether their sons may soon march away. Inside cabins, illuminated by candlelight, old memories return. The smell of wood smoke fills the air. Rain taps against rooftops. Mothers sew clothing in silence. Fathers sharpen tools with nervous concentration. And grandparents remember. They remember 1776. They remember exile. They remember beginning again. No one wishes to lose everything twice. Historians still argue whether many people truly expected war. Some evidence suggests that ordinary settlers remained optimistic. Others reveal widespread anxiety. Perhaps both emotions existed together. Humans are wonderfully capable of hope and fear at the same time. And then on June 18, 1812, the United States declares war on Great Britain. The news spreads slowly. Riders carry messages. Churches whisper rumors. Merchants exchange nervous glances. Some cheer, some curse. Many simply stare into silence. Because another conflict has arrived. And once again, ordinary families will pay the highest price. Outside summer evenings remain beautiful. Crickets sing beneath endless stars. Fireflies dance above fields. Rivers continue flowing peacefully toward distant lakes. Nature remains indifferent. Yet beneath those quiet skies, armies are already preparing. American generals imagine swift victories. British officers hope merely to survive. And across Upper Canada, descendants of refugees sharpen axes, repair muskets, and prepare to defend homes their parents built from wilderness. Homes they never intend to abandon, not again. Section 8. Summer sunlight still warms the fields when the first rumors reach your ears. At first, they sound almost ridiculous. American soldiers crossing into Canada? Surely not. After all, many families living along the border still have cousins in New York. Merchants continue trading goods. Travelers pass back and forth. Churches pray in the same language. Farmers complain about weather with equal enthusiasm. Surely neighbors do not march against neighbors. History, unfortunately, enjoys irony. By July of 1812, the war that once seemed distant has become painfully real. And on paper, the outcome appears obvious. The United States has nearly 8 million people. Upper Canada has fewer than 100,000 settlers. British regulars are scarce. Supplies are limited. Roads are terrible. And much of the defense depends upon local militias. Many American leaders expect the campaign to be short. Some believe Canadians will welcome them. Others assume resistance will collapse after a few victories. One congressman even declares that the conquest of Canada would be a matter of simple marching. Simple marching. Those words would age about as gracefully as milk left in the sun. Still, confidence remains high. American troops gather near the Detroit frontier. Horses stamp impatiently beneath summer skies. Officers inspect maps. Drums echo through camps. Campfires crackle softly at night, while soldiers speak of glory, quick victories, and returning home before winter. Human beings do love optimistic schedules. Meanwhile, across the river, life in Upper Canada feels strangely uncertain. The smell of fresh-cut hay hangs in the air. Women gather vegetables from gardens. Children chase chickens through dusty yards. Church bells ring peacefully on Sunday mornings. Yet beneath that calm surface, anxiety grows. Men begin drilling with local militias. Weapons hidden since the Revolution are cleaned and repaired. Muskets are inspected. Powder is measured carefully. Old veterans speak quietly beside evening fires. They have seen war before, and they know that wars rarely unfold according to plans. General Isaac Brock, commander of British forces in Upper Canada, understands the danger immediately. Historians generally agree that Brock possessed energy confidence and perhaps an alarming willingness to take risks. Fortunately for Canada, history occasionally rewards bold personalities. Brock realizes something important. The colony cannot survive through numbers alone. It must survive through determination. And speed. Very speed. He travels tirelessly between settlements, encouraging militia units and strengthening defenses. His presence inspires confidence among settlers, already nervous about invasion. One curious detail recorded by contemporaries describes Brock's impressive height and commanding appearance. Some accounts may exaggerate his physical presence, though historians continue debating exactly how much of his reputation became legend after his death. People have always enjoyed turning heroes into larger-than-life figures. Meanwhile, another remarkable leader emerges. Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief and leader of a growing indigenous alliance. Tecumseh understands that American expansion threatens native lands throughout the region. For years, he has worked tirelessly to unite different nations against further settlement. Historians still discuss the full size and complexity of his confederacy, but few question his extraordinary influence. His alliance becomes one of the most important factors in the coming struggle, and perhaps one of the least understood by later generations. As August approaches, tension spreads across the frontier. The smell of smoke rises from military camps. Mosquitoes buzz relentlessly through warm evenings. Horses snort nervously beside wagons loaded with supplies. River currents shimmer beneath moonlight. Everything feels strangely quiet. Too quiet. And then General William Hull crosses into Canada. American troops march confidently onto British soil. Flags wave. Drums beat. Officers issue orders. Some soldiers expect cheering crowds. Instead, they encounter uncertainty and silence. Many settlers remain loyal to Britain. Others simply wish to avoid destruction. Few rush forward to welcome invaders, because home, after all, is not always where your grandparents were born. Sometimes home is simply where your children sleep. Hull quickly discovers that supplies are difficult to maintain. Roads are poor. Communication is slow. Information remains unreliable. Rumors multiply faster than facts. And rumors, unfortunately, have tremendous talents for frightening people. Stories spread about Tecumseh's warriors. Stories grow larger with each telling. Perhaps too large. Historians continue debating exactly how much fear influenced American commanders. But fear certainly existed, because war is never fought only with bullets. It is fought with uncertainty, with sleepless nights, with imagination. And imagination often creates monsters far larger than reality. Inside cabins. Throughout Upper Canada, candles burn late into the evening. Families gather quietly. The smell of stew fills small rooms. Mothers rock restless babies. Fathers listen for distant sounds beyond the darkness. Grandparents remember another war, another separation, another uncertain future. No one speaks much. There is little to say. Outside, crickets sing beneath warm summer skies. The stars remain beautiful. Nature remains peaceful. Yet armies now stand only miles apart. And while American commanders still expect easy victories, General Brock and Tecumseh are preparing something entirely unexpected. Not a desperate defense, not a slow, low retreat, but a bold gamble, one that will shock the United States and convince the world that Canada may not fall so easily after all. Section 9. By the middle of August 1812, the air along the Detroit frontier feels thick and restless. Warm winds drift across the river, carrying the smell of wet grass, campfire smoke, and horses that have worked far too hard in summer heat. Insects hum through the evening, and somewhere beneath the stars, nervous sentries stare into darkness, imagining dangers that may or may not exist. War has a remarkable talent for making shadows seem larger, and General William Hull is beginning to see shadows everywhere. Only weeks earlier, American confidence had been overflowing. Officers expected victories. Politicians imagined triumphs. Newspapers spoke confidently of conquest. Reality, however, has begun offering different opinions. Supplies are difficult to protect. Communication remains unreliable. Rumors spread endlessly. And somewhere beyond the forests, Tecumseh and his warriors have become the subject of terrifying stories. Some are true. Others grow larger with every retelling. Fear, after all, enjoys exaggeration. Meanwhile, General Isaac Brock arrives with characteristic energy. The British commander understands something important. His forces are outnumbered. His supplies are limited. And if he waits too long, disaster becomes inevitable. So he chooses something unexpected. He decides to attack. Historians generally agree that Brock possessed unusual confidence. Some might even call it reckless confidence. Fortunately for him, history occasionally rewards reckless confidence. The British regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors under Tecumseh gather near Detroit. Campfires flicker beneath humid skies. The smell of roasting meat drifts through camps. Muskets are cleaned. Boots are repaired. Quiet conversations fill the night. And then comes one of the most fascinating performances in military history, because Brock and Tecumseh understand psychology. Very well. One curious detail preserved in accounts suggests that Tecumseh's warriors repeatedly marched through visible areas, creating the illusion of much larger numbers. Historians continue debating exactly how much of this story became legend, but many agree that deception played a significant role. Human beings are often frightened by what they imagine, perhaps even more than what actually exists. Brock writes a carefully worded message to Hull. He warns that he cannot guarantee control over indigenous warriors if battle begins. Hull reads the message and worries about the safety of civilians. Those worries grow larger, and larger, and larger. Poor General Hull. He had expected grateful Canadians. Instead, he finds uncertainty, isolation, and fear. On the morning of August 16, 1812, British artillery opens fire. Smoke fills the air. Cannons thunder across the river. The smell of gunpowder spreads through Detroit. Women gather children. Soldiers scramble into position, and General Hull makes a decision that shocks everyone. He surrenders, without a major battle. Nearly 2,500 American troops become prisoners. Fort Detroit falls. Just like that, the victory astonishes both sides. British officers can hardly believe their success. Canadian settlers celebrate with relief. And Tecumseh earns enormous respect among allies and enemies alike. Historians still discuss Hull's decision. Some argue he acted to protect civilians. Others believe fear and confusion overwhelmed him. Perhaps both explanations contain truth. History often prefers complicated answers. Back in Washington, news of the surrender arrives slowly. And when it finally arrives, disbelief follows. Surely there must be some mistake. Surely Detroit cannot have fallen. Surely the war cannot be going this badly. Surely. That word again. Meanwhile, throughout Upper Canada, church bells ring with celebration. The smell of fresh bread fills kitchens. Children laugh freely. Farmers return to fields with renewed confidence. For the moment at least, disaster has been avoided. But perhaps the greatest consequence of Detroit lies beyond the battlefield. Something deeper has changed. The descendants of Loyalist refugees now understand that they have defended their homes. Not British homes, not American homes. Their homes. That distinction matters, more than anyone realizes. Young men who once thought of themselves as settlers begin thinking of themselves as defenders. Communities that once remembered exile now celebrate victory. And slowly, almost invisibly, a shared identity grows stronger. One built not through speeches, but through survival. One strange tradition recorded after Detroit, tells of families preserving pieces of captured American flags as souvenirs. Historians debate how widespread such customs truly became, though similar keepsakes certainly existed. Human beings have always enjoyed collecting reminders of unlikely victories. Still, celebrations remain cautious, because everyone understands something important. The war is far from over. The United States possesses greater resources, greater population, and wounded pride. Wounded pride, unfortunately, tends to be highly motivated. Autumn begins approaching. Cool winds move through forests. Leaves slowly change colors. The smell of apples and wood smoke returns to villages. Yet behind those peaceful signs of nature, soldiers continue marching. Families continue worrying, and new dangers approach. General Brock's triumph has saved Upper Canada, but triumph itself carries risks, because success often encourages boldness, and bold men sometimes ride toward destiny without realizing it. Within weeks, Isaac Brock will once again lead his soldiers into battle, and beside the Niagara River, one of the heroes of Canada will meet his fate, leaving behind a legend, and a nation that still does not quite realize it is becoming one. Section 10. The first cool winds of autumn arrive quietly. Morning mist rises above the Niagara River, and the smell of damp leaves fills the air. Apples ripen in orchards. Farmers hurry to bring in the last harvest before frost arrives. Geese begin their long journeys south, their calls echoing across pale skies. Nature, as always, follows its own schedule. War, unfortunately, prefers interruptions. The victory at Detroit has transformed spirits throughout Upper Canada. Church bells ring more confidently. Tavern conversations grow louder. Militia officers stand a little straighter. Children hear stories about General Brock and Tecumseh spoken with admiration around evening fires. For a moment, hope feels stronger than fear. But hope can be dangerous, especially when it convinces people that fortune will always remain loyal. American forces, embarrassed by the loss of Detroit, turn their attention toward the Niagara frontier. Troops gather along the river. Supplies arrive. Officers prepare new plans. No one expects surrender this time, certainly not after the humiliation of August. Meanwhile, General Isaac Brock refuses to sit comfortably behind fortifications. Historians generally agree that Brock possessed courage in generous amounts, perhaps too generous. His energy seems endless. He rides constantly between positions, encourages militia units, and refuses to allow discouragement to settle over the colony. One British officer later remarked that Brock appeared incapable of remaining still, which sounds exhausting, honestly. By October 1812, American troops prepare to cross the Niagara River near Queenston Heights. Before dawn, the air feels cold and wet. Fog drifts over the water. Oars splash softly in darkness. Soldiers whisper nervous prayers. And then, as sunlight begins touching the hills, the battle begins. Musket fire cracks through the morning air. Smoke fills the valley. The smell of gunpowder spreads across the riverbanks. American troops manage to establish positions on the heights. Their success threatens British control of the region. News reaches Brock quickly. Too quickly. Without hesitation, he rides toward the fighting, perhaps with too much determination. Historians still discuss his decisions that morning. Some believe he acted with extraordinary bravery. Others suggest he exposed himself unnecessarily. Both explanations may contain truth. Heroes, after all, are still human beings. As Brock arrives, he immediately organizes counterattacks. Witnesses describe him wearing his bright officer's uniform, making him highly visible, which in battle is not always ideal. One curious story claims Brock shouted, "Push on, brave York volunteers," moments before charging forward. Historians debate the exact words he used. Memory tends to polish famous moments. Reality rarely provides perfect quotations. Then comes tragedy. A musket ball strikes Brock, and within moments, the man who had become the soul of Upper Canada's defense is gone. Just like that. 34 years old. Gone. News spreads quickly across the battlefield. Soldiers stare in disbelief. Militiamen feel their confidence falter. Many fear everything may collapse. But another commander, Roger Hale Sheaffe, arrives and reorganizes the defenses. British regulars, militia units, and indigenous warriors regroup. Later that afternoon, they launch a successful counterattack. American forces surrender. Queenston Heights remains in British hands, and the victory, though costly, becomes legendary. Yet celebrations feel quieter now, because triumph carries sorrow. Inside homes across Upper Canada, candles burn late into the night. Families speak softly. The smell of stew fills kitchens, but conversations remain subdued. People who never met Brock mourn him as though they had lost a neighbor. Perhaps because symbols matter. And Brock had become a symbol. Not simply of Britain, not merely of military success, but of survival. One traveler later noted that settlers spoke of Brock with remarkable affection. Historians generally agree that his death elevated him from commander to legend almost immediately. Human beings often create heroes after losing them. It seems to be one of our oldest habits. Meanwhile, Tecumseh continues fighting beside British forces. His alliance remains essential. Along the frontier, indigenous warriors prove invaluable in scouting, intelligence, and warfare. Yet their contributions would often receive far less attention in later generations. History can be unfair that way. As winter approaches, the conflict settles into an uneasy rhythm. Snow begins covering roads. Rivers freeze. Campfires burn brighter against the darkness. Soldiers wrap themselves in wool blankets and dream of warm homes. The smell of pine smoke hangs in the air. Ice forms along windows, and families pray for peace. But peace remains distant. The war has already lasted longer than many expected, and the easy conquest predicted by American politicians has failed. Completely. Something else is becoming clear as well. The descendants of refugees no longer think of themselves as temporary settlers. They have buried fathers here, built churches here, defended rivers and fields here, and now they have watched heroes die here. Home, you discover, is often defined by sacrifice, not by birth, not by maps, but by what people are willing to protect. Outside, winter winds whistle through bare branches. Snowflakes drift silently across lonely roads. Wolves howl somewhere far beyond the settlements. And beneath those long northern nights, another year of war quietly waits, along with new victories, new tragedies, and a remarkable alliance that will soon face its greatest test. Because far to the west, Tecumseh's dream is approaching a crossroads, and history is preparing to ask him for everything. Section 11. Winter settles over the frontier with quiet determination. Snow blankets the forests. Ice forms along the edges of rivers. The smell of burning pine fills cabins during long evenings, while candlelight flickers softly against rough wooden walls. Outside, the wind whistles through bare branches, and somewhere far beyond the settlements, wolves announce themselves to the frozen darkness. It is beautiful and bitterly cold. War does not stop for winter, but winter certainly makes war miserable. Soldiers huddle around campfires, wrapping themselves in wool blankets that never seem quite warm enough. Boots freeze, fingers ache, horses struggle through snow-covered roads. Supplies arrive slowly, if they arrive at all, and everyone misses home, which historians might agree has always been one of the least surprising parts of warfare. Yet while snow covers Upper Canada, another struggle continues beneath the surface, a struggle for survival and for identity. Because for Tecumseh, this war has never been merely about Britain or the United States. It is about land and memory and the future of indigenous nations. For years, Tecumseh has traveled across vast distances, speaking with chiefs and leaders from many tribes. His dream is ambitious, perhaps impossibly ambitious. He hopes to create a confederacy strong enough to stop American expansion. Historians still debate how close he came to achieving that dream. Some emphasize the remarkable unity he inspired. Others point to divisions that proved difficult to overcome. Perhaps greatness often exists somewhere between success and failure. Still few question his leadership or his courage. British officers admire him deeply. Soldiers respect him. Even American enemies acknowledge his abilities. One American officer later described him as possessing extraordinary dignity and intelligence. High praise from an opponent, and rather rare. Meanwhile, ordinary families throughout Upper Canada endure another difficult winter. The smell of stew and fresh bread fills kitchens. Children play beside fireplaces. Mothers mend clothing. Fathers repair tools while listening to the wind outside. Life continues, because life always insists on continuing. One curious tradition among settlers involved placing heated bricks inside beds before sleeping. Historians know the practice existed, though its popularity varied. On nights when temperatures plunged, such simple comforts became treasures. Winter encourages creativity and gratitude. As spring approaches in 1813, the war begins changing. American commanders learn from earlier failures. Supplies improve. New offensives are planned. Naval battles erupt across the Great Lakes. Villages experience uncertainty once again. The conflict grows larger and more dangerous. The smell of mud replaces snow as roads thaw beneath gray skies. Rivers swell with spring rain. Canoes return to the water. Birds sing once more above forests awakening from winter. Nature, as always, offers renewal. Human beings, unfortunately, often offer more fighting. By September 1813, events take a troubling turn. American naval forces win control of Lake Erie. The victory changes everything. British supply lines weaken. General Henry Proctor, commanding British troops and allied indigenous warriors, decides to retreat westward. Tecumseh is furious, and perhaps understandably so. He believes retreat means abandoning territory and communities that have already sacrificed so much. Witnesses record heated disagreements between Tecumseh and Proctor. Historians continue debating the exact words exchanged, but no one doubts the tension. One famous account describes Tecumseh comparing Proctor to a fat dog that carries its tail between its legs when frightened. Perhaps not the sort of comparison any general enjoys hearing. Still, the retreat continues. British soldiers march through rain and mud. Wagons creak along miserable roads. Horses stumble. Families flee alongside the army. Smoke rises from abandoned settlements. The smell of wet earth and exhaustion follows everyone. And behind them, American forces pursue relentlessly. Then on October 5, 1813, near the Thames River in present-day Ontario, everything changes. The Battle of the Thames begins. The morning feels cool and gray. Fallen leaves cover the ground. Muskets crack through the forest. Horses charge. Smoke drifts between trees. And somewhere, amid the chaos, Tecumseh falls. Exactly how he dies remains uncertain. Historians still argue over who fired the fatal shot. Different accounts emerged almost immediately, and many contradictions survive. But one truth remains beyond dispute. Tecumseh is gone. With his death, his great Confederacy begins to unravel. His dream of a permanent indigenous homeland fades, and North America changes forever. British officers mourn him. His warriors mourn him, and even American soldiers speak of him with respect. That kind of respect cannot be ordered. It must be earned. Back in Upper Canada, news spreads slowly. Candles burn late into the night. Families gather around tables. The smell of soup fills quiet kitchens. Another hero has fallen. First Brock, now Tecumseh. Two men from vastly different worlds, yet both had become symbols of resistance, and both are gone. Still, the war continues, because wars sadly possess very little respect for grief. Outside, autumn leaves dance beneath cold winds. Frost begins returning to the fields. Geese fly south beneath endless skies. And somewhere far away, events in Europe are about to change everything. Because Napoleon Bonaparte, the man whose wars shaped the entire world, is beginning to lose. And when Europe finally catches its breath, Britain will have something it has lacked for years: time and soldiers. Lots of soldiers. Section 12. By the winter of 1813, you begin to notice something strange. People have stopped talking about quick victories. Nobody speaks confidently about simple marches anymore. Nobody predicts easy triumphs. War has a remarkable talent for educating optimists. The air feels sharp beneath gray skies. Snow crunches beneath boots. The smell of burning cedar drifts from chimneys, mixing with the scent of stew simmering above fireplaces. Candles burn late into the evening as families gather close together against the cold. Outside, the world feels quiet. Inside, worries remain loud. After nearly 2 years of fighting, exhaustion settles over North America. Farmers have left fields. Merchants have lost fortunes. Young men have disappeared into armies. And mothers everywhere have learned to hate unexpected knocks at the door, which sadly remains one of the few universal experiences shared by every war. In Upper Canada, villages still bear scars. Burned homes stand abandoned. Supply shortages continue. Yet ordinary life stubbornly survives. Children still laugh. Churches still fill on Sundays. Dogs still bark at strangers, and occasionally at absolutely nothing. Some traditions, thankfully, remain eternal. Meanwhile, the death of Tecumseh has changed the balance of power. His great alliance begins dissolving. Historians continue debating whether his dream could have survived under different circumstances. No one can say for certain. History does not enjoy answering what-if questions, but his absence leaves a void impossible to ignore. Far away across the Atlantic, events in Europe are moving toward their own climax. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who has dominated European affairs for years, suffers terrible setbacks. His disastrous invasion of Russia weakens France. Coalition armies press forward. Kingdoms that once feared him begin fighting back. British newspapers grow hopeful. British politicians breathe easier, and British generals begin looking beyond Europe. One curious detail recorded in London during these years described exhausted citizens lighting bonfires and celebrating every rumor of French defeats. Historians know such celebrations occurred, though reports often exaggerated their size. Human beings have always enjoyed celebrating before victories become official. Sometimes rather prematurely. Back in North America, winter camps remain miserable places. Soldiers wrap themselves in damp blankets. Snow blows through cracks in cabins. Boots wear out. Supplies arrive late. Men dream of warm kitchens and familiar faces. The smell of coffee and wood smoke fills the air each morning. Frost coats tents and wagons. Horses huddle together against bitter winds. War feels less glorious than recruiters promised. Considerably less glorious. Yet despite the hardships, the conflict continues. American armies achieve successes. British forces strike back. Naval battles rage across lakes. Villages exchange hands. And neither side manages to deliver the final blow. Historians generally agree that by late 1813, both nations are becoming frustrated, perhaps exhausted, perhaps stubborn. Likely both. Then, in early 1814, everything changes. Napoleon falls, at least temporarily. Europe breathes, and Britain suddenly discovers something remarkable. It no longer needs every soldier in Europe. Veteran regiments become available, battle-hardened men who have marched across Spain and Portugal, men who have fought French armies for years, men accustomed to hardship and discipline. And now they are coming to North America, not thousands of inexperienced recruits. Veterans, experienced veterans. That news spread slowly across the Atlantic. Inside taverns and government offices, maps are studied carefully. British leaders discuss strategy. American politicians watch nervously. Because the war that once seemed secondary now commands greater attention. Meanwhile, life in Upper Canada continues with surprising normality. Maple syrup flows with the spring thaw. Rivers break apart beneath melting ice. Birds return to forests. Children run through muddy roads with endless energy. The smell of wet earth fills the air. Nature awakens, and people hope. Hope that perhaps peace cannot be far away. Surely after years of fighting, both sides must desire an end. Surely everyone has suffered enough. Surely common sense will prevail. Poor common sense. It spends much of history waiting patiently outside locked doors. One unusual story preserved in family letters tells of settlers holding dances even while battles continued elsewhere. Historians know communities booked organized gatherings whenever possible, because life cannot pause forever. People fall in love, children are born, songs are sung, even during war. Especially during war. Still beneath those moments of joy, something larger approaches. British reinforcements continue crossing the ocean. Ships sail westward, carrying officers and soldiers hardened by years of European warfare. And with them comes a new determination, no longer merely defending Canada, no longer simply surviving. Now, Britain seeks something else. Leverage, a stronger position, perhaps revenge, perhaps peace. History, as always, refuses to choose only one answer. Far to the south, Americans remain confident. They have endured setbacks before. They have survived worse. Washington itself feels safe. After all, enemy armies are far away, very far away. Or so people believe. But beneath the calm summer skies of 1814, British commanders are already preparing plans that few Americans could imagine. Plans that will carry war into the very heart of the young republic. And before the year ends, smoke will rise over a city that never expected to see flames. Section 13, the summer of 1814 arrives with a strange sense of confidence. Not in Canada, not in Britain, but in Washington. The capital of the young United States sits quietly beneath warm skies. The smell of freshly cut grass drifts through open windows. Horses pull carriages through muddy streets. Government clerks shuffle papers beneath the slow movement of hand fans, hoping for relief from the humid air. Life feels normal, perhaps too normal. Because while Congress debates, merchants sell their goods, and families gather for evening meals, something extraordinary is happening across the Atlantic. Napoleon Bonaparte has fallen, at least for the moment. Europe, exhausted after decades of war, finally breathes again. And Britain, for the first time in years, possesses something it has desperately lacked. Freedom. Not freedom from enemies. Freedom to focus. Veteran regiments that once fought in Spain and Portugal are now available for service elsewhere. Thousands of experienced soldiers board ships bound for North America. Not boys. Veterans. Men hardened by years of campaigning beneath European skies. Historians generally agree that British leaders had no intention of conquering the United States. Their goals remained limited. They hoped to pressure American negotiators and strengthen Britain's position during peace talks already underway. But pressure sometimes arrives in surprising forms, and surprises unfortunately tend to attract attention. One curious rumor circulating among British officers claimed that Americans were so divided politically that serious resistance might collapse quickly. Historians still debate how widely such assumptions were believed. Human beings, regardless of nationality, possess endless confidence in predictions. Predictions rarely return the favor. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans continue their daily routines. Farmers harvest wheat. Children chase dogs through dusty roads. Women bake bread while listening to distant thunder rolling across summer skies. The smell of peaches and fresh hay fills the countryside, and few people imagine enemy soldiers approaching the capital itself. After all, Washington remains relatively young. It lacks the grandeur of European cities. Many foreign visitors describe it as unfinished. Streets remain rough. Buildings stand far apart. Mud and mosquitoes receive frequent complaints. Perhaps mosquitoes are history's most consistent survivors. Still, the city represents something important. It is the heart of the Republic, the symbol of independence, and surely symbols remain safe. Surely. By August, British commanders launch operations along Chesapeake Bay. Admiral Alexander Cochrane commands naval forces. Major General Robert Ross leads veteran troops ashore. These are professionals. Men who have spent years fighting Napoleon. They move quickly, and they move with confidence. American leaders react with uncertainty. Some believe Baltimore will become the target. Others suspect different locations. Information arrives slowly. Rumors spread quickly. Which historians might agree remains one of humanity's favorite combinations. President James Madison attempts to organize defenses. Militia units gather. Volunteers prepare. Officers argue. Not unusual. Military arguments have existed since the invention of military organizations. On August 24, 1814, American and British forces meet near Bladensburg, Maryland. The weather feels unbearably hot. Dust rises beneath marching feet. The smell of sweat and gunpowder fills the air. Cannons thunder beneath blue skies. Horses scream. Officers shout conflicting orders. And then confusion spreads. Militia units break. Lines collapse. Men retreat. Some later refer to the battle as the Bladensburg races. Not exactly the sort of nickname commanders dream about. Historians continue debating the causes of the defeat. Poor organization, inexperienced troops, and effective British attacks all contribute. Perhaps no single explanation tells the whole story. History rarely enjoys simple answers. President Madison himself witnesses part of the retreat. The unimaginable is happening. The road to Washington lies open, and British troops are marching toward the Capitol. Inside Washington, panic spreads. Families gather possessions. Government clerks rush through hallways carrying documents. Horse-drawn wagons fill the streets. The smell of smoke from campfires drifts through the evening air. Some citizens flee. Others remain. Dolley Madison, the First Lady, refuses to leave immediately. She supervises efforts to save important papers and possessions from the White House. One famous story tells of her rescuing Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. Historians agree the painting survived thanks to her efforts, though the details have grown somewhat legendary over time. Heroes often attract legends, and legends enjoy embellishment. As darkness approaches, British troops enter Washington. To their surprise, resistance proves minimal. The streets feel strangely quiet. Windows remain shuttered. The city waits. And somewhere beyond the gathering darkness, one of the most astonishing nights in American history is about to begin. Because for the first and only time in the nation's history, a foreign army has captured the Capitol. And before dawn arrives, flames will illuminate the summer sky. Flames that people on both sides will remember for generations. Section 14. Night falls slowly over Washington. The heat of August lingers in the air long after sunset. Crickets sing beneath dark trees. Humid winds drift through quiet streets. The smell of dust and horses hangs over the city, while somewhere in the distance, boots echo against muddy roads. The Capitol feels strangely empty. Too empty. Hours earlier, panic swept through the streets. Government officials fled. Wagons rattled away carrying furniture, documents, and whatever possessions people could rescue in haste. Families locked doors and prayed. And now, British soldiers walk through the capital of the United States. It is one of the most extraordinary moments in American history. Not because the city is conquered, but because almost nobody imagined such a thing could happen. Historians generally agree that British commanders did not intend to occupy Washington permanently. They had neither the manpower nor the desire. Their purpose was psychological: to demonstrate strength, to answer earlier American attacks, and perhaps, just perhaps, to remind the young republic that wars often produce unpleasant surprises. One event especially weighed heavily on British minds: the burning of York. Present-day Toronto. Earlier in 1813, American troops had occupied the town and set fire to public buildings. British officers never forgot, and now revenge had arrived. Human beings, unfortunately, have long memories when flames are involved. As British troops enter the city, discipline remains surprisingly strict. Major General Robert Ross issues orders forbidding looting. Soldiers receive instructions to destroy public buildings, not private homes. Historians still discuss how consistently those orders were followed, but evidence suggests that British commanders sought controlled destruction rather than chaos. War, even revenge, occasionally attempts manners, though manners and warfare rarely become close friends. Inside the President's house, later known as the White House, an unfinished dinner still sits upon tables. Plates remain prepared. Wine glasses wait untouched. Servants and staff had departed only hours earlier. One curious story claims British officers paused long enough to enjoy the abandoned meal before continuing their work. Historians continue debating how much truth hides within that tale. Still, the image survived, and perhaps people simply enjoy imagining hungry officers helping themselves to someone else's supper. British soldiers soon begin setting fires. The Capitol, the Treasury, the War Department, the President's house. Flames rise into the humid night sky. Smoke drifts above the city. The smell of burning wood and plaster fills the air. Sparks dance upward beneath the stars. Orange light reflects from windows and rooftops. And Washington burns. Not entirely, not endlessly, but enough. Enough to shock the nation. Enough to create memories lasting centuries. One witness later described the scene as both terrible and strangely beautiful. Historians know several observers spoke of the flames illuminating the night sky for miles around. Beauty and tragedy occasionally arrive together, though nobody invites them. Meanwhile, British soldiers continue their work. Public buildings are destroyed methodically. Some private homes remain untouched. Civilians hide indoors, listening to crackling fire and distant voices carried through darkness. The smell must have been overwhelming. Smoke, ash, summer heat, fear. Imagine standing behind shuttered windows, hearing strange voices outside while the city glows beneath firelight. Sleep would not come easily. Back in Britain, news of the victory will eventually bring satisfaction. Back in America, outrage and embarrassment spread together. Newspapers publish stories. Politicians argue. Citizens struggle to understand how their capital fell so easily. Historians continue debating who deserves blame. Military commanders, political leaders, poor planning, bad luck. Perhaps all of them. History has plenty of blame to distribute. Then, something unexpected happens. Nature intervenes. A violent storm sweeps across Washington. Strong winds howl through streets. Rain pours from dark skies. Some accounts even describe tornado-like conditions. Buildings collapse. Cannons are overturned. British soldiers seek shelter from the chaos. Historians generally agree that an unusually severe storm struck the city, though details remain uncertain. Whatever its exact nature, the storm helps extinguish many fires. Nature, it seems, occasionally decides enough is enough. By the next day, British forces prepare to leave. They have achieved their objective. Washington remains wounded, but not destroyed. The government survives. The Republic survives. And perhaps that matters most. One strange rumor spread afterward claimed that British troops regretted burning the city. Historians still debate such stories. Emotions among officers varied considerably. Human beings rarely agree completely about anything, not even victory. As British soldiers march away, smoke still rises from ruins. The smell of charred wood lingers over blackened walls. Citizens slowly return. Shock gives way to determination. Embarrassment transforms into anger. And anger, as history repeatedly demonstrates, possesses remarkable energy. Far from breaking American resolve, the burning of Washington strengthens it. Because humiliation has a way of hardening nations. Outside the ruined capital, summer slowly begins surrendering to autumn. Leaves prepare to change colors. Cooler winds approach. And while the White House still smolders, another city farther north braces for attack. A city protected by ships, by soldiers, and by stubborn defenders. A city called Baltimore. And there, beneath rockets and cannon fire, a song will be born. A song that future generations will know by heart. Section 15. By September of 1814, the smell of smoke has faded from Washington. But the memory remains. Memories you discover linger far longer than ashes. Across the United States, newspapers carry dramatic accounts of the burning of the Capitol. Citizens speak with anger. Politicians blame one another. Taverns buzz with rumors. Farmers discuss the war between harvests. Families gather around fireplaces wondering what disaster might come next. And somewhere beneath all that fear, something unexpected begins to grow. Determination. Because humiliation has strange effects upon people. Sometimes it breaks them. Sometimes it hardens them. And in the autumn of 1814, Americans become determined not to suffer another humiliation. Meanwhile, British commanders turn their attention toward Baltimore. Unlike Washington, Baltimore matters. Very much. It is one of America's busiest ports. Privateers operating from the city have harassed British shipping throughout the war. British officers consider it a troublesome nest that deserves attention. Not exactly flattering language. Still, war rarely produces flattering descriptions. The city prepares anxiously. Church bells ring. Militia units gather. Cannons are positioned. Families hide valuables. And everyone watches the horizon. The smell of sea salt fills the harbor. Fishing boats rock gently beneath gray skies. Merchants board windows. Soldiers sharpen bayonets. Rain clouds drift overhead. Autumn approaches, and with it, another battle. On September 12th, British troops land near Baltimore. Veteran soldiers under General Robert Ross begin advancing toward the city. These men have marched across Europe. They have fought Napoleon's armies. They are professionals. But even professionals experience bad luck. During the advance, American riflemen ambush the British column. And in one of history's curious twists, General Ross is struck and mortally wounded. Historians still debate whether the shot was lucky or inevitable. Perhaps fate enjoys irony. The commander who entered Washington triumphantly will never see Baltimore. Leadership passes to Colonel Arthur Brooke. The attack continues. But something else must happen first. Fort McHenry must fall. Because as long as the fort protects Baltimore Harbor, British ships cannot safely approach the city. And so, during the night of September 13th, British warships begin bombarding the fort. The air fills with thunder. Cannons roar. Rockets scream across the darkness. The smell of salt water mixes with gunpowder smoke. Rain falls steadily. Lightning flashes across restless clouds. Soldiers inside the fort endure hour after hour beneath exploding shells. And still they remain. One curious detail survives from the battle. The rockets used by British forces produced eerie red trails across the night sky. Historians know these Congreve rockets often frightened observers more than they damaged fortifications. Fear, after all, can be highly theatrical. A young lawyer named Francis Scott Key watches the bombardment from a ship in the harbor. He had come under a flag of truce to negotiate the release of a prisoner. Instead, circumstances trap him within sight of the battle. All night long he watches. The flashes, the smoke, the rockets, the endless uncertainty. Historians generally agree that weather conditions and darkness prevented observers from clearly seeing the fort for much of the night, which means something terrible might have happened, or perhaps not. No one knows, and uncertainty is exhausting. Inside Baltimore itself, citizens wait nervously. Candles burn late. Children sleep beside worried parents. Church bells remain silent. The smell of damp earth rises after rain. Horses stamp nervously in muddy streets. No one sleeps well. No one breathes easily. Then dawn arrives, and through the fading smoke, something appears. The American flag, still flying, large, visible, defiant. Francis Scott Key later writes words inspired by what he witnessed. Words that will eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner. Historians still debate whether the poem captured every detail accurately. Memory often prefers emotion over precision. But emotion matters. Sometimes even more than facts. British commanders, recognizing that Baltimore remains heavily defended, decide against continuing the assault. The city survives, and suddenly, after the embarrassment of Washington, Americans find hope again. Not victory, not yet, but hope, which can be surprisingly powerful. Meanwhile, on both sides of the Atlantic, another process quietly unfolds. Diplomats gather. Letters travel. Negotiations continue. Because after years of war, everyone is growing tired. Soldiers are tired. Families are tired. Governments are tired. Even newspapers seem tired. And perhaps exhaustion accomplishes what wisdom cannot. Peace. Far away in Europe, representatives from Britain and the United States meet in the city of Ghent. Conversations begin. Arguments follow. Compromises seem impossible. Then possible. Then impossible again. Human beings truly excel at making peace difficult. Yet despite pride, anger, and memories of burned cities, something remarkable slowly becomes clear. Neither side truly wants endless war, and perhaps they never did. Outside, leaves drift gently from trees. Frost returns to northern fields. Geese once again fly south beneath pale autumn skies. Nature continues, as it always does. And somewhere beyond the oceans, diplomats are preparing documents that will finally bring silence to North America. Though neither side yet realizes that one final battle still waits. And history being history, intends to save one last surprise for the end. Section 16. As winter approaches once again, something curious happens. The war begins ending, and almost nobody knows it. In an age before telegraphs and instant messages, news travels with frustrating patience. Ships cross oceans when winds allow. Letters move at the speed of horses. Rumors arrive weeks ahead of certainty, and often contain equal portions of truth and imagination. Which honestly sounds rather familiar. By December of 1814, diplomats representing Britain and the United States have spent months negotiating in the Belgian city of Ghent. Tempers have flared, demands have changed, arguments have stretched endlessly, and eventually, exhaustion begins accomplishing what pride could not. On December 24th, both sides sign the Treaty of Ghent. The war is over, at least on paper. The smell of candle wax fills quiet rooms in Europe as diplomats exchange documents. Outside, cold rain falls upon cobblestone streets. Church bells ring in distant towers. Gentle winds sweep across the canals. Peace has arrived, but peace travels slowly, very slowly. Thousands of miles away in North America, soldiers remain unaware. Armies still march, cannons remain loaded, and one final chapter waits impatiently for history. Meanwhile, winter settles across the continent. Snow covers roads leading through Upper Canada. Ice forms along rivers. The smell of burning maple logs drifts from chimneys. Families gather around warm fires, grateful simply to have survived another year. No one knows that the war has already ended, which is both amusing and slightly tragic. Human beings occasionally continue fighting after agreeing to stop. One curious story from the period describes merchants celebrating rumors of peace several times before official confirmation arrived. Historians know false reports spread frequently. People heard what they desperately wanted to hear. And who could blame them? Far to the south, British troops under General Edward Pakenham prepare for an assault near New Orleans. American forces under General Andrew Jackson strengthen defenses around the city. Both commanders believe the war continues, because as far as they know, it does. The air around Louisiana feels completely different from the frozen north. Warm breezes carry the smell of marshes and wet earth. Spanish moss hangs from trees. Strange bird calls echo through the swamps. Fog rises from the Mississippi River beneath pale dawn skies. It is a different world, and yet the same war. Historians still debate British objectives at New Orleans. Some argue they hoped to control the Mississippi. Others emphasize strategic bargaining positions. Whatever their intentions, events soon take unexpected turns, as they usually do. On January 8, 1815, British troops attack. Cannons roar through morning mist. Gunpowder smoke drifts across fields. The smell of wet grass mixes with sulfur and fear, and the assault collapses. British casualties mount. General Pakenham falls. American defenders celebrate. Andrew Jackson becomes a national hero. And one of the most famous battles in American history takes place after peace has already been signed. History does enjoy strange jokes. News of New Orleans reaches Americans before news of the treaty itself. The victory electrifies the nation. Church bells ring. Newspapers rejoice. Citizens celebrate with enormous enthusiasm. To many Americans, it feels like a final triumph, and perhaps emotionally it is. Historians continue discussing whether the battle changed the terms of peace. Most agree it did not. The treaty had already been signed. But facts and feelings do not always travel together. Feelings usually arrive first. Back in Canada, people celebrate too. The war has ended. The invasion failed. Their homes remain their own. Churches hold services of thanksgiving. Villagers gather for meals. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread fills crowded rooms. Children laugh freely. Soldiers return to families they feared never seeing again. Some return older. Some return wounded. And some do not return at all. Such has always been war's cruel arithmetic. One interesting tradition recorded in several communities involved ringing church bells and firing muskets into the air when news of peace finally arrived. Historians know celebrations varied greatly, but relief itself proved universal. Relief requires no language, or flags, or politics, only gratitude. The Treaty of Ghent restores borders largely to their pre-war positions. No territory changes hands. No great conquests emerge. Neither side wins everything. Neither side loses everything. Which historians might gently observe often describes successful peace treaties. Still, something important has changed. Americans remember surviving. Canadians remember resisting. Britain remembers preserving its colonies. And indigenous nations remember promises that increasingly seem fragile. Their story sadly does not end with peace. Not in the same way. Outside winter snow sparkles beneath moonlight. Wolves move silently through forests. Rivers remain frozen beneath endless stars. And for the first time in years, fathers sit beside fireplaces without worrying about invasion. Mothers sleep peacefully. Children dream quietly. War has ended, but history has already begun transforming memories into legends. And legends, unlike wars, rarely end. Section 17. When the cannons finally fall silent, you might expect life to return to normal. But normal is a curious thing. Once people have lived through revolution, exile, invasion, and war, the old normal rarely returns. Something changes inside them, quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. And by 1815, North America itself has changed. Not on maps, not immediately, but inside people's minds. The smell of spring rain fills the air as rivers break apart beneath melting ice. Farmers return to fields abandoned during campaigns. Oxen pull plows through dark soil. Children chase one another beneath blue skies, while birds sing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Nature remains wonderfully indifferent. Human beings, however, remember. In the United States, the end of the war brings enormous pride. Newspapers celebrate New Orleans. Politicians speak of honor and independence. Veterans tell stories around tavern tables. Young boys listen with wide eyes. And somehow, the burning of Washington slowly becomes only one chapter among many. Americans prefer remembering victories. Most nations do. Historians generally agree that the War of 1812 strengthened American nationalism. Citizens who once identified strongly with individual states begin seeing themselves more clearly as Americans, not Virginians, not New Yorkers, Americans. The young republic, despite all its frustrations and embarrassments, has survived another great test. And survival creates confidence. Sometimes healthy confidence. Sometimes not. Human beings rarely know the difference until much later. North of the border, something equally remarkable is happening, but far more quietly. The descendants of Loyalist refugees no longer think of themselves as temporary settlers. Their parents had arrived carrying memories of New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. They had spoken endlessly about homes left behind. But those memories belong to another generation now. This generation remembers Brock. They remember Queenston Heights. They remember Detroit. They remember invasion. And they remember surviving. One curious observation from visitors during the years after the war described settlers speaking proudly of our country when referring to Upper Canada. Historians continue debating when exactly a Canadian identity emerged, but many believe the war played an important role. Shared dangers create shared memories, and shared memories create nations. Churches rebuild, roads improve, villages grow. The smell of sawdust and fresh lumber fills expanding towns. Blacksmiths hammer iron beneath open windows. Ships carry timber down rivers toward distant ports. Life slowly resumes its ordinary rhythms. And ordinary life feels wonderful. Perhaps because people appreciate it more after losing it. Meanwhile, veterans return home. Some return with medals. Some return with scars. Some return with stories they tell repeatedly. And some return with stories they never tell at all. Historians still argue about the psychological effects of war in earlier centuries. Records are incomplete. Human suffering rarely leaves tidy paperwork. But silence itself often tells stories. Families gather around evening fires once more. The smell of stew rises from kitchens. Candles burn softly. Grandparents speak about strange years their grandchildren can barely imagine. Children born after the war listen with curiosity. To them, these stories sound almost unbelievable. British soldiers marching through Washington, former Americans defending Canada. The White House in flames, surely not. And perhaps that is how history begins fading. Not through forgetting, but through distance. One unusual tradition survived among some Loyalist families. Parents preserved old Keys letters and family Bibles brought from the United States decades earlier. Historians know many treasured these objects as reminders of lives left behind. Objects become memories. Memories become stories. Stories become history. And history becomes quieter with every generation. Meanwhile, Britain celebrates peace with far less emotion. After all, British citizens have spent years fighting Napoleon. To many people in London, the War of 1812 feels like a smaller chapter within much larger struggles, which occasionally irritates Canadians and Americans. Quite understandably. Still, the empire moves forward. Trade expands, immigration increases, and North America enters a new age. But not everyone emerges from the war victorious. Indigenous nations, especially those who had fought beside Tecumseh, face painful realities. Promises made during wartime prove increasingly fragile. American expansion resumes. Old fears return. Historians continue debating whether Britain could have done more to support Indigenous allies after peace arrived. No answer satisfies everyone. History rarely provides comfortable endings. Outside, summer evenings return. Fireflies dance above quiet fields. Crickets sing beneath endless stars. The smell of pine forests drifts through open windows. Peace feels real, and perhaps that is enough. For now. Because while ordinary families continue building farms and raising children, something much larger has already happened. Without treaties declaring it, without speeches announcing it, two nations have begun growing apart. Not enemies, not strangers, but something different, something separate. And all because thousands of frightened families chose to leave America in 1783. A choice made in sadness, a choice that changed a continent. Though few people realize it yet. Section 18. Years pass quietly, much more quietly than the years before. And perhaps that is the greatest blessing of all. The smell of fresh hay returns every summer. Rivers continue flowing toward distant lakes. Children grow into adults. Adults grow into grandparents. Churches fill every Sunday. Markets become busier. Roads improve. New settlements appear where forests once stood. Life moves forward, because life always does. By the 1820s and 1830s, many people who survived the Revolution and the War of 1812 are growing old. Their hair turns gray. Their hands become slower. Their voices softer. But their memories remain sharp, especially at night, especially beside warm fireplaces. Imagine sitting with an old man during a winter evening. Snow taps gently against window panes. Pine logs crackle inside the hearth. The smell of tea and wood smoke fills the room, while grandchildren sit quietly at his feet. And he begins with the words, "I was just a boy when we left New York." Or perhaps, "Your grandmother crossed the ocean with only 2 trunks." Or maybe, "I remember the day Brock died." Children listen, sometimes patiently, sometimes not. Human beings, especially young humans, have always possessed remarkable talents for becoming distracted. Still, the stories continue, because stories are how memories survive. Historians generally agree that oral traditions preserved countless details never written down. Diaries, letters, and official documents reveal much. But family stories often preserved emotions that records could not capture. How fear felt, how homesickness lingered, how hope survived. Those things are difficult to measure, yet they matter deeply. One curious habit among elderly loyalists involved describing places they had not seen in 40 years with astonishing precision. Historians still marvel at letters filled with memories of specific roads, orchards, and churches long abandoned. Memory is strange that way. It sometimes preserves childhood landscapes more faithfully than yesterday's breakfast. By now, younger generations view themselves differently. They are British subjects, certainly, but they are also something else, something new. People living in Upper Canada increasingly speak about their communities with pride. They celebrate local victories. They honor Brock and Tecumseh. They tell stories about resisting invasion. And slowly, almost invisibly, the idea of being Canadian begins taking root. Not fully, not yet. Historians still debate precisely when Canadian identity truly emerged. Some point toward Confederation decades later. Others see earlier origins hidden within these frontier communities. Perhaps nations like trees grow slowly enough that no one notices, until one day they cast shadows everywhere. South of the border, Americans are changing too. The population grows rapidly. New states join the Union. Steamboats travel rivers. Cities expand. Factories appear. Roads stretch westward. And memories of the Revolution become legends. George Washington becomes larger than life. The War of 1812 becomes a story of survival and honor. The burning of Washington remains painful, but New Orleans shines brighter. Nations, it seems, prefer hopeful memories. One interesting observation from European travelers described Americans and Canadians as remarkably similar people. Despite their political differences, historians continue discussing this idea today. Same language, similar customs, shared ancestors, different paths. Perhaps history enjoys irony, because the descendants of those refugees who fled America now find themselves separated from cousins only a few days' travel away. Families remain divided by borders, yet united by blood. Letters continue crossing rivers and lakes. Relatives visit whenever possible. Weddings reconnect branches of families separated by decades. And occasionally, arguments about politics still spoil supper. Some traditions never disappear. Meanwhile, the graves of the first refugees begin multiplying beneath northern skies. Simple stones, simple names, simple lives. Men and women who left homes behind. Men and women who built new ones. Many never became famous. Most never expected to. Historians still argue over how much influence ordinary settlers truly had upon larger events. But perhaps they ask the wrong question, because history is not only shaped by generals and presidents. Sometimes it is shaped by mothers packing trunks, by fathers cutting timber, by children learning new songs, and by families choosing hope over despair. Outside, autumn leaves drift quietly toward the earth. Geese fly overhead. Frost returns once again to fields that have known generations of footsteps. The world changes, then changes again. And slowly the people who experienced those remarkable years begin disappearing, one by one, leaving behind stories and objects and memories. Yet memory itself is fragile. Children become busy. Grandchildren grow older. Wars come and go. And eventually, extraordinary events begin fading into ordinary history. Until one day, many people forget entirely that some of the first American refugees were Americans themselves, and that the road leading to the burning of Washington began not with hatred, but with divided loyalties and families saying goodbye. Section 19. By the middle of the 19th century, the voices of the old refugees have grown quiet. Most are gone now. The men and women who packed wagons, boarded crowded ships, and left the United States forever exist only in fading portraits and weathered gravestones. Their grandchildren speak of them with affection. Their great-grandchildren know only fragments, and fragments, unfortunately, are slippery things. The smell of old paper fills dusty attics. Family Bibles rest inside wooden chests. Yellowed letters lie folded beneath ribbons. Keys carried north in 1783 sit forgotten inside drawers, their locks long vanished. Objects survive. Meanings sometimes do not. Historians generally agree that memory changes with every generation. Details disappear. Emotions soften. Stories become simpler. Perhaps simpler than reality, which seems rather unfair to reality, because reality had been wonderfully complicated. Former Americans had defended Canada. British soldiers had burned Washington. Indigenous warriors had shaped the fate of a continent. And ordinary families had endured all of it. Yet with passing years, nations begin telling stories that comfort them. Americans celebrate independence. Canadians celebrate resistance. Britain remembers Napoleon. And each nation gently rearranges memories according to its own needs. Human beings are excellent storytellers, though not always reliable historians. One curious detail preserved by descendants of Loyalists involved family members carefully maintaining old accents and expressions inherited from New York and Pennsylvania. Historians know some communities retained speech patterns for generations. Language remembers, even when people forget. Meanwhile, railroads appear, steamships multiply, telegraphs transform communication. The world becomes faster and strangely smaller. Children born in the 1850s cannot imagine waiting months for news from Europe. Grandparents shake their heads in disbelief at these astonishing inventions, which historians might observe has happened every time new technology arrives. Human beings enjoy surprising one another. But even as life changes, traces of the old stories remain. Monuments rise. Brock's memory endures. Tecumseh's name survives. The White House is rebuilt. Washington continues growing. And across Canada, towns founded by Loyalist settlers continue expanding. Their descendants become farmers, teachers, lawyers, ministers, ordinary people, which is perhaps the highest compliment history can offer, because ordinary life means survival. Historians still debate the extent to which the War of 1812 truly created Canadian identity. Some scholars emphasize later events. Others point to shared experiences during the conflict. Perhaps both explanations are correct. History rarely belongs to a single moment. It grows, slowly, like rivers, like forests, like families. One unusual tradition survived among some descendants of Loyalists. Family reunions occasionally included stories about the old country, and surprisingly, the old country meant America, not Britain, America, because memories rarely obey borders. Imagine a summer evening in the late 19th century. Fireflies drift above quiet fields. The smell of apple pie fills the air. Grandchildren laugh while elderly relatives sit upon porches beneath fading sunlight. And someone begins another story about New York, about crowded ships, about Brock, about Washington burning. Young listeners nod politely, though perhaps they are thinking about other things. Young people often do, and so stories become quieter, then shorter, then forgotten. Outside, the world changes rapidly. New nations emerge. Empires expand. Wars come and go. Generations rise and disappear. Yet beneath all that noise, one truth remains. The United States and Canada share something unusual, not merely a border, not merely a language, but memories. Shared memories, painful memories, unexpected memories, and memories born from families divided by revolution. Historians continue arguing over countless details, numbers, motives, decisions, timetables. Historians, after all, would become terribly unhappy if they stopped arguing. But few disagree on one simple fact. Without those refugees who fled north after 1776, Canada would have become something very different. And without the invasion of 1812 Americans, and Canadians might have understood themselves differently as well. History turns upon curious moments, and often upon ordinary people. People who never imagine they are changing the world. Outside evening settles gently over fields and rivers that have witnessed generations come and go. Crickets sing, stars appear one by one above the darkness, and somewhere beneath those same stars, forgotten names rest quietly beneath old stones. Still waiting, still remembered, at least for tonight. Section 20. Tonight, after all the marches and speeches after the smoke above Washington, and the long roads leading north, you find yourself surrounded not by armies, but by memories. The war is over. The fires are cold. The cannons are silent. And the people who lived through those extraordinary years have long since disappeared. Yet somehow they remain. The smell of pine forests still drifts across Canadian lakes. Warm summer winds still move through valleys in New York and Pennsylvania. Autumn leaves still fall beside the St. Lawrence River. Snow still blankets the same roads where frightened refugees once traveled with uncertain hearts. Nature remembers nothing, and yet somehow it preserves everything. Historians generally agree that the years between 1776 and 1814 changed North America forever. Two nations emerged with different identities, different memories, and different stories about themselves. But perhaps the most remarkable part of tonight's journey lies elsewhere, because history often speaks about governments, about presidents, about kings, about generals, and certainly those people matter. But beneath every great event stand ordinary human beings, people who packed trunks, people who kissed loved ones goodbye, people who crossed rivers, people who buried parents, people who raised children, people who simply hoped tomorrow might be kinder than yesterday. And perhaps that hope changed history more than anyone realized. One curious fact still surprises historians today. Some descendants of Loyalist refugees eventually moved back to the United States generations later, while others remained in Canada forever. Bloodlines crossed borders repeatedly. Families, it seems, have little respect for political boundaries. Historians still debate many questions surrounding those years. Why some remained loyal, why others embraced revolution, why ordinary people made the choices they did. Perhaps certainty itself is impossible, and perhaps that is perfectly acceptable. Human beings are wonderfully complicated creatures. We love, we argue, we remember, and occasionally we forgive. Outside, the world moved forward. Railroads arrived. Telegraphs followed. Cars appeared. Airplanes crossed oceans. Wars far larger than the War of 1812 came and went. Empires rose. Empires disappeared. Maps changed. Governments changed. And through all those years, the descendants of those frightened families simply lived their lives. Most never became famous. Most never expected to. Yet the world they inherited had been shaped by choices made beside candlelight around dinner tables and during quiet conversations between husbands and wives who wondered whether leaving home was madness or necessity, perhaps both. And so tonight, as the sounds of the modern world begin growing quieter, you might picture a final scene. Not a battlefield, not a burning city, not politicians arguing, just a simple cabin beside a northern river. Snow falls gently outside. A fire crackles softly inside. The smell of cedar and warm bread fills the room. An old man sits beside the hearth. Across from him sits a curious grandchild. And somewhere between the dancing shadows and the soft glow of candlelight, the old man smiles. Then he begins. I remember when my father brought us here, and once again the story lives. Now, allow your thoughts to grow slower. The rivers have become quiet. The campfires have faded. The ships have long since reached their destinations. The horses have stopped their journeys, and the voices that once argued over kings and revolutions have become gentle echoes beneath distant stars. Perhaps somewhere above those stars, old enemies sit together now. No longer patriots, no longer loyalists, no longer British soldiers or American militiamen. Simply people. People who loved their families. People who feared uncertain futures. People who tried in their own imperfect ways to build homes and protect those they cherished. The night grows deeper. The wind moves softly through endless forests. Snow falls quietly upon forgotten roads. And beneath peaceful skies stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes, the memories of those remarkable years rest gently at last. Their journeys are finished. Their burdens have grown light. And tonight, as sleep slowly finds you, their stories can finally rest. As can you. End of script. Sleep well.